So I'd like to give you a few bull points and a couple of bear points in the world of tech. I think let's just start by, let's just move to the next slide. Right. So just revisiting a slide that you've seen already, but just reflecting on the top 5 companies in the world. Obviously, they all happen to be tech companies, and they've all done particularly well, particularly during this COVID period. While the US GDP dropped by 9.5% in the second quarter, these top 5 companies grew their revenues by just under 18%, and their operating income was up 9%. So the question for me is, what does this mean for the composition of overall markets? So, the top 5 companies historically were a collection of stocks from different sectors. But for now, all of the top 5 are technology companies. If you go back a few years ago, you would have had 1 or 2 oil companies. Exxon would have made it on the list, maybe a bank. And if you went back slightly further, you would possibly have a pharmaceutical company like Pfizer on that list. But what's happened in recent years is that because of the economics of tech, where you have increasing returns and network effects, tech has become quite dominant in the overall composition of the market. And what that means really is it's become quite top heavy. So the S&P 500 at the moment, about 23% is those top 5 companies make up about 23% of the S&P 500. And that's compared to an average of about 13% over the last 40 years. If you look at the top 10 companies as a percentage of the S&P 500, that's running at about 29%. And that's by far the highest we've seen in well over 40 years. So this attracts attention. And I guess, we are seeing several investigations into the technology sector. The Democratic Party in the US is linked with the neo-Brandesian wing, which is an antitrust or anti-competitive movement in a way led by someone like Lina Khan. And their idea would be, well, maybe we need to break up some of these tech companies because they've become so dominant and they're abusing their dominance. Other people on the Republican side would say, well, maybe we just need to enforce some of the rules and stop some of the mergers or some of the takeover activity that's been very prevalent since the 1980s. Before the 1980s, the tendency was to say no to most deals, but since the 1980s, most deals really have been passed through. And we've developed this increasing dominance from the big companies as their market shares have grown. So I think this is a very complex field looking at anti-competitive measures in the technology field. It's difficult to understand. There's a lot of data collection that goes on from all these firms, but it's not widely understood, certainly by the politicians and by the wider public. So I think we're in the early days, but in my mind, there's no doubt that things will change and the environment won't be as easy for tech companies like a Facebook to buy a WhatsApp or an Instagram in the early years. So this is just something that I like to keep an eye on, and it's certainly getting a lot of attention now. But what else? Surely there are other things that can knock tech companies off their perches. This is just a slide of the different of the market cap of the biggest tech companies over the decades. And the point to show here, I mean, the little squares in blue, those reflect companies when they first entered the top 20 biggest market cap tech companies. So Microsoft joined really I'm showing this is 1990, the year 2000, 2010, and 2020. And what you'll notice here is that in recent decades, in 2010, there weren't many new entrants into the top 10 of major tech companies. So we only had Alphabet, Apple, and Samsung joining the top 10. And in this latest, this is the 2020 numbers. This is to the end of June of 2020. We've also only had 3 companies joining the top 10 of the biggest companies in the world. So I think what this shows me is that it's becoming more difficult to break into the top 10. And I don't think that's really a surprise right now. You know, a lot of these big companies, they collect data. There's a lot of surveillance going on, and they can pick up what customers are finding popular amongst new technology launches. And they either might buy those companies out, or they might launch competing products. So, you know, we've seen that with something like TikTok. It's become very successful in the last while. And now Facebook has launched a competing product. So possibly the tech space become more difficult to break in at the top level and become a major platform. But, you know, things will change. And as we saw with IBM, if you look back to 1990, IBM was the biggest tech company in the world. It stayed on the list in 2000 and in 2010, and now for the first time it's fallen off the list. And the market cap of IBM is 110 billion, so well out of the top 20. So I think some other ones to watch, Oracle was at number 3 in 2000 and number 6 in 2010. And it really has slipped down. Now it's down at number 20. So I think Oracle has battled with the shift to the cloud, and it has lost some relevance in the market. I think one that's interesting for me at the moment is Alphabet. Alphabet is number 4. This is as of June 2020. Alphabet, in a recent Economist article, was described as having entered middle age. And I think they need to be careful. Obviously, a huge reliance on online advertising. And that market is I would argue, is beginning to mature. So Alphabet might be where Microsoft was several years ago when Satya Nadella took over and pushed Microsoft into the cloud. So Microsoft is very unusual here. It stayed in the top 2 for the last 20 years. So let's maybe just turn to some of the high growth areas in the tech space, and really why we're still very excited about growth over the long term in technology. So I've made some comments about digital advertising, which is 50% of, well, at the end of last year was 50% of total advertising. And you would argue that there is some room for growth there, using the China example, which was up at 70% of advertising was digital. But we've seen the sensitivity to this downturn in the online players like an Alphabet. But I think if you compare that with e-commerce, e-commerce just has fantastic growth ahead. We had a very strong quarter from Amazon in the second quarter. Their revenues are up 40%, and similar growth rates from some of the other big e-commerce players around the world. The cloud is another space that has many years of growth ahead, and this really will benefit a lot of the small software as a service players and Amazon and Alibaba. And then on-demand services, which is a relatively new category, will benefit companies in the online food delivery like Meituan, Dianping in China, and Delivery Hero, and several others. So there's still plenty of growth ahead in a range of different categories, and I'm just showing a few here. If we look at it in a slightly different way, also considering how much growth lies ahead, if you think of how much businesses have digitalized over the recent years, you'll see that we've obviously had a lot of digitalization happening in the tech industry, the media industry, and in finance, and now increasingly in retail, although South Africa obviously is is way behind in online retail. But you can see that there are so many in the other industrial sectors that have a long way to go to digitalize and become more efficient. With sort of upgraded business models. So we would say that there's enormous growth there, and that opens up opportunities for disruptive companies to come in and try and extract value in those sectors. So we still see the big companies like Microsoft also helping a lot of those companies in their shift to digital. So plenty of room for growth in these other areas that have lagged in recent years. So I think just in closing, I think the point for us is over the long term, the tech sector will tend to outperform. And then really two reasons for that. The one are the superior economics with increasing returns due to network effects. And the other reason is because there is still so much growth ahead in many parts of the economy that rely on technology. A point that Henry made is value creation is often back-end loaded. The whole point in a technology business is to try and ensure dominance over many years. Profitability is less important. And once you've ensured dominance, then you can begin to monetize. So there's a tendency towards monopolies and a tendency towards winner takes. Certainly, if not a complete monopoly, to winner takes most. So our view for investors is to make an allocation to tech and to stay the course. Now, tech is obviously in a sweet spot at the moment. Most of the tech companies have benefited from, well, many of them have benefited from the COVID pandemic. So you would argue that many of the shares are over-owned. But this might really just mean that there's some short-term underperformance potentially in tech over the next few months. But over the long term, with this sort of growth profile ahead and the superior economics, we would suggest then that people just stay the course.